Hey there, fellow literature explorers. Today, we turn our gaze toward No Man's Land, 2001. A war drama that offers much more than narrative surface. It's a text rich with thematic complexity, symbolic resonance, and intricate character work that invites rigorous analysis. I'm delighted you've joined me, because in this video, we'll engage in a detailed examination of its cinematic language, narrative structure, and intertextual layers that shape its meaning. We'll begin by situating the film within its cultural and theoretical context, unpacking its stylistic choices and the director's auteur signature. Next, I'll provide a concise yet nuanced overview of the narrative arc, highlighting the film's core motifs without diluting its interpretive possibilities. From there, we'll delve into a compelling plot summary that foregrounds its narrative strategies and rhetorical devices, all framed to prepare you for the unfolding complexities. Crucially, we'll tease key thematic elements and pivotal narrative shifts, those moments that challenge conventional readings and open the text to multiple interpretations. Throughout, expect us to consider character dynamics, cinematic techniques like mise-en-scene and editing, and the film's engagement with broader discourses in film and literary theory. Prepare to engage with this film not just as viewers, but as scholars, questioning, interpreting, and appreciating the layers beneath its surface. So, get comfortable, sharpen your critical lens, and let's embark on an intellectually rewarding exploration of this cinematic work. The first time I encountered this story, it wasn't just another war film to me. It felt like stepping into a philosophical parable that used the immediacy of battle not to glorify it, but to strip it bare. The cultural context in which the film appeared was one of unease. Conflicts in the Balkans were still fresh in collective memory, the scars visible not only in landscapes but in discourse. Where other films chose to depict sweeping battles or broad political gestures, this one narrowed its lens onto an absurdly intimate situation. A handful of soldiers, trapped between shifting lines, caught in a space that belonged to neither side. That single premise becomes metaphor, an allegory for the futility of war, for the absurdity of nationalism, for the way individuals are reduced to pawns in conflicts that outgrow human comprehension. As an overview, the film is deceptively simple in structure yet endlessly layered in implication. Two soldiers from opposing sides find themselves stranded together in a trench, stranded in territory that belongs to no one and everyone. With them lies another figure, injured and precariously lying atop a landmine that will explode if he shifts his weight. This is the film's genius. It turns war into theater of absurd, compressing entire geopolitical conflicts into the claustrophobic dynamics of three men, watched by the world yet helpless to alter their own fates. International forces hover at the edges, journalists swarm, politics intrude, but at the center remains this absurd tableau, a stalemate that is at once tragic and comic, human and inhuman. The plot begins with motion, with a small band of soldiers trying to navigate through fog and uncertainty. In the confusion of shifting front lines, two enemies find themselves thrown together in the same trench, first confronting one another with weapons raised, then forced into reluctant coexistence. Tension crackles in every glance, every word, as mistrust and hatred war with the undeniable fact that both men are equally trapped, equally human. Into this volatile space comes the wounded man, whose body becomes symbol. He cannot move without detonating the mine beneath him. Suddenly, survival hinges not on outgunning the other, but on negotiating impossible fragility. From here, the narrative tightens like a noose. The soldiers bicker, threaten, mock, and occasionally cooperate, their interactions an echo of the larger conflict raging beyond. Outside forces attempt to intervene, the United Nations, journalists eager for stories, but bureaucracy, politics, and public relations prove as useless as guns in the trench. The absurdity mounts. Global institutions that pride themselves on peacekeeping are rendered impotent, reduced to spectators of tragedy. The characters themselves oscillate between moments of humanity and eruptions of hatred, their banter darkly comic, their standoff increasingly surreal. What excites me about recounting this story is how suspense is built not from sprawling battles but from claustrophobic inaction. Every conversation feels like a duel, every silence heavier than artillery. The landmine becomes the ultimate symbol of war's futility. One wrong move, one twitch, and destruction follows. Yet no one can disarm it. Not the soldiers, not the UN, not the larger powers who watch from afar. The mind sits there, a mocking reminder that violence is baked into the very ground. The soldiers are left trapped, the audience trapped with them, in a narrative that denies neat resolution. And here we find the tease of key elements and major twists. The film delights in undermining expectations. We expect camaraderie to emerge between enemies, but distrust never disappears. We expect institutions to save, but they flounder. We expect narrative closure, but the story ends in unresolved tragedy, a grim mirror to reality itself. The twist is not a single revelation but the realization that the entire premise is twist, that war offers no catharsis, that the battlefield produces not heroes but absurd stalemates. Even the humor, so dark and biting, is a twist. We laugh at the absurdity only to feel that laughter curdle into discomfort. What lingers most is the film's insistence on contradiction. It is comic and tragic, intimate and global, absurd and devastating. It uses the microcosm of a trench to indict the macrocosm of international politics, uses the bodies of three men to symbolize nations, histories, and ideologies. And in doing so, it denies us comfort. It does not allow us to leave believing war can be tidied up by treaties or interventions. Instead, it leaves us with the image of men stranded in a space that belongs to no one, a metaphor as bleak as it is true. As we prepare to dive deeper in future chapters, keep this in mind. This story is not just a war drama. It is allegory. It is absurdist theater in camouflage fatigues. It is a critique of human folly masquerading as simple narrative. And it invites us, as literature explorers, to examine every layer, every symbol, every contradiction, every unresolved silence. The first half of this story opens with the disorientation of war itself. Fog rolling across the battlefield, men stumbling through terrain that feels both familiar and alien, boundaries between friend and enemy blurred into the gray smoke of conflict. The soldiers are weary, their uniforms caked with mud, their movements cautious yet reckless, driven more by survival instinct than strategy. From the very first frames, there is a sense that the war is less about victory and more about endurance, less about triumph than about simply not being erased. Into this chaos, fate begins to arrange its cruel irony, leading us step by step into the narrow trench that will become both stage and prison. We follow a small band moving forward under cover of darkness. The camera lingers on their faces, hardened yet frightened, determined yet resigned. Orders echo in the background, half heard, half trusted. There is a sense of improvisation, of soldiers not quite sure whether they are advancing or retreating, whether this ground is theirs or the enemy's. Shots ring out. Explosions shatter the night. And within minutes, the careful choreography of war collapses into confusion. Men scatter, some falling, some pressing forward blindly. In the aftermath, silence replaces chaos, and in that silence the story takes its true shape. One soldier finds himself stranded, separated from his comrades, the ground around him littered with the debris of battle. He stumbles into a trench that seems abandoned, its mud walls slick, its floor uneven with remnants of past fights. But he is not alone for long. Across the trench, another figure emerges, weapon raised, uniform unmistakably belonging to the opposite side. The two men freeze, guns trained, hatred instinctive, survival instinct sharper. For a moment, it seems inevitable that one will kill the other, that this encounter will be brief and bloody. Yet hesitation creeps in. Neither man pulls the trigger. Suspicion hardens into words, words into uneasy silence, and then silence into something far stranger. The realization that neither can escape this place. The trench itself becomes character. Narrow, damp, claustrophobic, it is both shield and trap. The soldiers pace within it like caged animals, circling each other, muttering threats, issuing insults. Their language reveals centuries of division, propaganda and prejudice boiled into every phrase. They are enemies not because they know each other, but because the world insists they must be. And yet, as minutes pass, their shared predicament begins to erode the absolute certainty of their enmity. They remain distrustful, ready to lash out, but beneath the bravado there is flicker of recognition. Both are scared, both are stranded, both are pawns in a war that neither controls. Into this fragile standoff comes another presence. A wounded man, his body broken, his breathing ragged. At first he appears simply as another casualty, one more body among countless. But soon the terrible truth emerges. He is lying across a landmine, a cruel device that will detonate the moment he shifts. The tension that already crackled between the two soldiers now magnifies tenfold. The trench is no longer just a prison. It is a coffin waiting to be sealed. Every movement must be calculated, every breath measured. The man's suffering is immediate, raw, undeniable, yet his body has become both symbol and trap. They cannot abandon him, nor can they move him without risking obliteration. This revelation transforms the trench from battlefield to theater of absurd. The two soldiers, enemies by uniform, find themselves allies by necessity, though their cooperation is poisoned by suspicion. They argue, they bicker, they accuse each other's armies of greater atrocities, each convinced of their side's righteousness. Yet as they circle the wounded man, trying to devise solutions that do not exist, their hostility softens into reluctant recognition. They remain divided, but the absurdity of their situation forces them to see each other not only as symbols of an enemy nation, but as men equally trapped by forces far larger than themselves. Outside the trench, the world remains restless. UN peacekeepers patrol, their presence looming yet ineffectual. The international forces, meant to symbolize order, reveal themselves to be bound by bureaucracy, their decisions mired in hesitation, their actions governed more by politics than compassion. Their radios crackle with half-hearted commands, their uniforms neat but their hands tied. The trench, invisible to them in its immediacy, becomes metaphor for how the world ignores the small human tragedies in pursuit of broader political posturing. Meanwhile, journalists sniff out the story. They arrive with cameras, hungry for footage, eager to transform suffering into spectacle. Their presence adds another layer of absurdity, as the intimate, agonizing standoff is repackaged into images for international consumption. The soldiers, still trapped, still arguing, are suddenly aware that they are being watched, not just by each other, but by the entire world. Their plight becomes theater not only for themselves but for an audience beyond the battlefield, an audience more concerned with headlines than human lives. The first half of the story lingers in this suspended tension. Every attempt at resolution collapses into failure. Every plan to move the wounded man falters against the implacable threat of the mine. Every effort to escape the trench founders on the futility of war itself. The soldiers' conversations veer from venomous to darkly comic, from accusations to shared laments. They tell stories of their lives before the war, fragments of humanity peeking through the armor of enmity. And yet, just when connection seems possible, distrust resurfaces, reminding us that centuries of hatred are not so easily dissolved. By the midpoint, the absurdity has become unbearable. The men remain trapped, their comrades still precariously alive yet doomed, the outside world watching but incapable of acting. What began as a story of two enemies has become parable of futility. The trench is not only a physical space but a metaphor for war itself. Narrow, suffocating, filled with bodies and blame, promising no exit but destruction. And so the first half ends with a sense of suspended breath. The men remain in stalemate, the mine remains a silent threat, the journalists and peacekeepers hover uselessly at the edges. Nothing resolves, because war itself resists resolution. What grips us is not the possibility of triumph but the inevitability of absurdity. We laugh uneasily at the banter, flinch at the fragility of the wounded man's situation, and realize that we too are trapped in this trench, waiting for a catastrophe that may never come but cannot be avoided. The story begins in the stillness after violence, the kind of quiet that feels less like peace and more like breath held before another storm. A thick fog clings to the battlefield, muffling sound and swallowing sight, leaving men to stumble through the terrain as if trapped inside a dream of endless mud and smoke. This is not the war of heroic charges and clean victories. This is war reduced to confusion, fear, and the instinct to survive. Soldiers creep forward in nervous silence, rifles raised, eyes darting for enemies they can barely see. Every movement carries the knowledge that death might erupt from the mist at any second. Within this haze, one group attempts to press forward. Their commander barks orders, but the commands barely pierce the fog, half-heard and quickly doubted. One of those fragments is a soldier who finds himself separated, stranded in the no-man's land that lies between the warring sides. He stumbles into a trench, its mud walls slick with recent rain, its floor littered with the debris of previous skirmishes. It feels abandoned, but the silence inside is heavy, as if the place itself is holding its breath. For a moment, he believes he has found refuge, a hollow to catch his breath and steel his nerves. Then another figure emerges. This new presence is unmistakably enemy. His uniform, his stance, the weapon in his hands, all scream opposition. The two men freeze, weapons raised, adrenaline surging through every muscle. It would be simple, one squeeze of a trigger, one more corpse in the mud. But neither fires. Something in the absurdity of the moment, two men isolated in the same trench, arrests them. Suspicion lingers in the silence between them, and slowly they lower their weapons just enough to speak, to measure each other not as faceless targets but as men caught in the same trap. The hostility doesn't vanish, but it begins to shift. The trench itself soon reveals its cruel secret. Another soldier lies there, wounded, his body twisted in pain. At first he appears to be merely injured, another casualty in need of aid. But when they try to move him, the horror becomes clear. He has landed on a landmine. His body weight is the only thing keeping the device from detonating. If he shifts, if he is moved, if pressure is lifted, the mine will explode, killing not only him but anyone nearby. Suddenly the trench is no longer just a hiding place. It has become a coffin suspended in time, its occupants prisoners of fragility. The discovery transforms everything. The two enemies, already forced into uneasy truce by circumstance, now find themselves bound together by the wounded man's fate. Their hatred simmers, but the immediacy of the threat pushes it aside. They bicker, they accuse each other's armies of atrocities, they spit out insults inherited from propaganda. Yet the very act of speaking, of arguing, becomes its own kind of intimacy. The absurdity of the landmine mirrors the absurdity of the war itself. One wrong move, one careless decision, and everything is obliterated. As hours pass, their exchanges oscillate between venom and reluctant understanding. One moment they threaten, the next they share scraps of their histories, stories of lives before uniforms, fragments of humanity beneath the masks of soldiering. They find in each other reflections of fear, of exhaustion, of men dragged into conflict larger than themselves. But just when the possibility of connection flickers, mistrust flares again. They circle each other endlessly, as if replaying the stalemate of nations within the claustrophobic walls of the trench. Beyond this mud prison, the world looms but does not help. UN peacekeepers patrol nearby, meant to be arbiters of order. Their presence, however, proves hollow. Bound by bureaucratic chains, their decisions are paralyzed by caution and politics. They hear reports of men stranded, they even glimpse the trench, but their rules and procedures leave them impotent. They are observers cloaked in authority, powerless to alter the scene before them. Their radios buzz with half-formed commands, their meetings are filled with hesitations, and their pristine vehicles idle while men bleed into the mud. The film skewers them not with bombast but with quiet irony. They are present, yet useless. Then come the journalists. Drawn by whispers of a human interest spectacle, they swarm with cameras and microphones, eager to transform suffering into narrative. They point lenses at the trench, capturing every exchange, every movement, reframing tragedy into footage for the evening news. The soldiers, already aware of their absurd predicament, now feel themselves performing unwillingly for a global audience. Their humanity is reduced to symbols on screens, their agony transformed into broadcast fodder. The media becomes another form of trap, just as confining as the mine, just as impossible to escape. The first half of the story builds its tension through this claustrophobic tableau. Every moment feels suspended, stretched between the inevitability of catastrophe and the fragile hope of survival. The wounded man groans, sweat beads on his face, each breath a reminder that time is slipping. The two soldiers argue over plans, test theories, shout for help, but no solution appears. Attempts to disarm the mine falter. Attempts to call for rescue dissolve into red tape and hesitation. The outside world circles but never intervenes decisively, and so we are left watching as the men themselves unravel. They laugh bitterly at the absurdity, they rage at the futility, they trade barbs that carry centuries of hatred, and yet beneath it all we glimpse their shared humanity. They are not generals, not politicians, not even representatives of ideology. They are simply men, trapped in a ditch, waiting for the ground beneath them to betray them. By this point, what began as an ordinary skirmish has transformed into something far more profound. The trench is no longer just a piece of terrain, it is a symbol of war itself, a place of confinement, futility, absurdity, and death. The landmine beneath the wounded man becomes metaphor for the conflict as a whole. Unstable, unmovable, and certain to destroy anyone who tries to tamper with it. The presence of peacekeepers and journalists underscores the impotence of institutions and the voyeurism of global spectatorship. And the soldiers themselves become allegorical figures, enacting on a small stage the same endless stalemate playing out across nations. The suspense of this first movement is unbearable because it is built not on what might happen, but on what cannot happen. No one can leave without risking death, no one can save the wounded man, no one can resolve the conflict. They are suspended between life and death, action and inaction, hatred and recognition. And in that suspension lies the absurd truth. This is war reduced to its essence, stripped of glory, revealed as theater of the impossible. And so we are left watching as the men themselves unravel. They laugh bitterly at the absurdity, they rage at the futility, they trade barbs that carry centuries of hatred, and yet beneath it all we glimpse their shared humanity. They are not generals, not politicians, not even representatives of ideology. They are simply men, trapped in a ditch, waiting for the ground beneath them to betray them. By this point, what began as an ordinary skirmish has transformed into something far more profound. The trench is no longer just a piece of terrain, it is a symbol of war itself, a place of confinement, futility, absurdity, and death. The landmine beneath the wounded man becomes metaphor for the conflict as a whole. Unstable, unmovable, and certain to destroy anyone who tries to tamper with it. The presence of peacekeepers and journalists underscores the impotence of institutions and the voyeurism of global spectatorship. And the soldiers themselves become allegorical figures, enacting on a small stage the same endless stalemate playing out across nations. The suspense of this first movement is unbearable because it is built not on what might happen, but on what cannot happen. No one can leave without risking death, no one can save the wounded man, no one can resolve the conflict. They are suspended between life and death, action and inaction, hatred and recognition. And in that suspension lies the absurd truth. This is war reduced to its essence, stripped of glory, revealed as theater of the impossible. His counterpart embodies the mirror image. Younger, sharper in demeanor, his aggression seems more immediate, his mistrust more raw. He enters the trench ready to kill, his suspicion flaring at every word. For him, the enemy is not abstract, it is the man standing in front of him. He spits venom not only out of ideology but out of fear, for to see the humanity of his opponent would mean admitting the futility of his own struggle. He is the soldier who cannot yet laugh at the absurdity, who clings to anger as shield against despair. Yet as the hours grind on, even his hostility softens, if only briefly, when fatigue cracks through and he glimpses fragments of connection. Together, these two are less individuals than halves of a whole. One weary, one fiery. One resigned, one combative. Their interactions echo the endless stalemate of the nations they represent. They circle each other in the trench like reflections in a mirror, each man's fear amplifying the other's, each man's humanity flashing through at unexpected moments. Critics often note how their conversations are riddled with contradictions, threats followed by confessions, jokes curdling into venom, silence punctuated by sudden laughter. They are not static archetypes but shifting figures, embodying the instability of war itself. Between them lies the wounded man, his body draped across the landmine. He is the purest symbol in the narrative, yet he is also character in his own right. His suffering is constant, his groans filling the trench, his presence a reminder that war's cruelty is not abstract but embodied in flesh and blood. He cannot rise, cannot move, cannot fight. His entire existence reduced to the paradox of survival through stillness. In this sense, he becomes the embodiment of stalemate itself, alive yet dead, present yet absent, the future hanging on his immobility. His character is defined not by what he does but by what he prevents others from doing. He is the immovable object at the heart of the story, a man who cannot be saved yet cannot be abandoned, forcing those around him to confront futility. The peacekeepers, though peripheral, are characters in the narrative as well. Their uniforms and vehicles, their radios and procedures, all speak of authority. Yet their defining trait is impotence. They embody bureaucracy, their words sterile, their actions stifled by rules. They are characters without agency, present yet powerless, visible yet ineffectual. Their very presence sharpens the absurdity. Men trained and armed to preserve peace reduced to onlookers, mouthing platitudes while life drains away in the trench below. They are less individuals than avatars of failed institutions, symbols of the gap between global ideals and ground-level reality. The journalists, too, form a chorus of absurdity. Hungry for spectacle, they crowd the edges of the narrative with cameras and microphones, reducing tragedy into consumable images. They are not cruel by intention but by design, their profession demanding that they frame suffering as story, that they extract drama from despair. They embody voyeurism, their humanity blurred by lenses. As characters, they represent the audience as much as the media. The outsiders who watch from safety, who consume war as narrative while remaining untouched by its immediacy. Their presence in the story is a mirror turned toward us. Each character, then, embodies a facet of war's futility. The weary soldier reflects exhaustion, the younger soldier reflects aggression, the wounded man reflects suffering, the peacekeepers reflect impotence, the journalists reflect voyeurism. Together, they form a mosaic of absurdity, their interactions echoing the contradictions of the larger conflict. None of them triumph, none of them resolve, none of them escape their roles. And that is precisely the point. What makes these characters compelling is not their development but their stasis. In most narratives, characters evolve, arcs bend toward redemption or ruin. Here, the arcs bend only toward stalemate. The weary soldier never finds peace, the younger never sheds suspicion, the wounded never rises, the peacekeepers never act, the journalists never intervene. Their lack of change is the story's cruelest truth. War does not transform so much as it traps, reducing individuals into frozen symbols of futility. And yet, within this stasis, flashes of humanity appear. A shared laugh at the absurdity of their predicament. A memory of home blurted out in anger. A glance of pity across the mud. These moments do not dissolve the hatred, but they puncture it briefly, reminding us that beneath the uniforms and rhetoric are simply men. The characters resist neat categorization because war itself resists it. They are not heroes, not villains, not martyrs, not saviors. They are humans caught in absurdity, and in their humanity lies the deepest critique. By the time the narrative closes, these characters linger not because of what they did but because of what they could not do. They could not save the wounded man. They could not overcome mistrust. They could not escape the trench. They could not move the machinery of war an inch. Their failure is their legacy, their impotence their indictment. And yet, in that failure, they force us to see the truth. That war devours humanity not through grand battles but through small stalemates, through individuals reduced to contradictions, through characters trapped in roles they cannot shed. This is why they endure in memory. They are not noble, not victorious, not even fully realized in the conventional sense. But they are unforgettable because they strip war of illusion. Through them, we see that the battlefield is not made of strategy and triumph, but of men stuck in mud, balancing on mines, arguing, laughing bitterly, dying pointlessly. The characters are the war, and the war is them. And in this recognition lies the story's most devastating truth. Every film carries with it shadows and echoes, the stories that never appear on screen but cling to its edges, shaping the atmosphere we feel even if we never see them. This one, a bleak and absurd meditation on war, brought its own collection of strange facts, behind-the-scenes curiosities, ironic coincidences, and unlikely truths that deepen the way we understand its impact. These details, some humorous, some unsettling, reflect the same contradictions that animate the narrative. Comedy and tragedy colliding in uncomfortable intimacy. The first strange fact lies in its recognition. Against the odds, a film made with modest resources and a premise so claustrophobic it could easily have been dismissed as unmarketable went on to win the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. This in itself is remarkable. An absurdist war parable from Bosnia capturing the attention of the most mainstream cinematic institution. It is as if the Academy, usually drawn to sweeping epics or lush dramas, could not escape the pull of this small, muddy trench. The irony is delicious. A story about men trapped in limbo resonated across the world, making the global stage itself a kind of extended no-man's land where art, politics, and recognition clashed. Another curiosity lies in how it was filmed. The trench that dominates the story was not some massive set constructed with Hollywood grandeur. It was dug by hand, shaped into muddy claustrophobia to ensure authenticity. The mud caked on the actors was real. The dampness seeped into their bones. Shooting days stretched on in the discomfort of cold, wet earth, and the trench itself became a character not only in the film but in the memories of the cast and crew. Some later joked that they could still feel the mud under their fingernails years later, as if the set refused to let them go. The landmine at the story's center, a simple prop, nothing more, took on its own mythology during filming. Though harmless in reality, its presence on set carried eerie weight. Cast and crew reported an involuntary tension whenever they worked near it, as if the fiction of its danger seeped into reality. One actor recalled catching himself stepping lightly, almost tiptoeing around it, before laughing at the absurdity of being intimidated by a lump of wood and paint. This instinctive caution mirrored the very absurdity the film sought to capture. The way fear can saturate the imagination even when rationality insists there is no threat. Then there is the peculiar fact of language. Filming brought together cast and crew from different countries, each speaking with their own inflections, their own histories woven into their accents. Communication on set sometimes mirrored the fractured dialogues of the story itself. Misunderstandings, translations, half-comprehensions. This multilingual atmosphere infused the production with its own sense of absurdity, the actors often joking that they were living the film's themes off-camera as much as on. The trench became both Babel and battlefield, every exchange layered with humor and tension born of cultural difference. The journalists who swarmed the story with their cameras were played by actors, of course, but they were joined at times by real reporters visiting the set. These real journalists, fascinated by the production, mingled with their fictional counterparts until crew members sometimes forgot who was acting and who was documenting. This blurring of fiction and reality created surreal moments where the film seemed to fold in on itself, reporters covering actors playing reporters covering war. The irony was not lost on anyone, and it became one of those oddities that cast and crew still retell with laughter and disbelief. Another strange detail is the reception in regions still raw from the very war the film depicted. Audiences there responded with uneasy laughter, nods of recognition, and at times tears. The humor, dark and biting, was not entertainment but catharsis, a way of seeing the absurdity of their own suffering reflected back at them. In some screenings, people reportedly argued aloud with the screen, voicing anger at the futility on display, as though the characters could hear them. The film was not consumed passively, it was confronted, wrestled with, lived again. The director himself was at times startled by how his vision was received. He spoke of wanting to capture not just the horror but the absurdity of war, insisting that the ridiculous and the tragic are inseparable. On set, he encouraged actors to lean into contradiction, to deliver lines with humor even when drenched in mud, to argue with venom only to collapse into laughter moments later. This approach produced performances that feel alive with instability, as if the characters themselves were uncertain how to balance comedy and despair. One of the strangest facts is how quickly the film became a teaching tool. Universities and schools adopted it not only for film studies but for political science, philosophy, even ethics. Professors used the trench as allegory, the mine as symbol, the stalemate as case study in futility. What began as a modest production evolved into an object of academic discourse, its absurdity dissected by scholars who found in it echoes of Beckett, Ionesco, and Sartre. The cast, amused, later joked that they had unwittingly created a syllabus rather than a movie. The production was also marked by its share of on-set absurdities. Equipment failed constantly in the damp environment. Cameras jammed, lights fizzled, costumes never dried. The mud itself seemed alive, swallowing boots, pulling at tripods, staining everything it touched. Actors occasionally slipped mid-scene, their falls so absurdly comic that the director considered keeping them in. At times, the crew laughed until they cried, finding release in humor much like the characters they filmed. The set became a no-man's land of its own, where absurdity and frustration lived side by side. Perhaps the strangest fact of all is the way the film has endured. Though it tells a story rooted in a specific conflict, its resonance has proven universal. Viewers from across the world, far removed from the Balkans, have found themselves unsettled by its absurdity, recognizing in it the futility of all wars, the failures of all institutions, the voyeurism of all media. Its trench, muddy and narrow, has become symbol not just of one conflict but of human folly itself. That such a small story could expand into such vast allegory is one of cinema's strangest and most powerful tricks. In the end, these facts, odd, unsettling, ironic, are not trivia but extensions of the story's spirit. The Academy's recognition, the muddy set, the prop that felt real, the babble of languages, the journalists who blurred fiction and reality, the academic adoption, the laughter on set amid tragedy, all reflect the same contradictions that shape the film. Comedy and despair, absurdity and sincerity, fiction and reality. They collide not only in the narrative but in its making, in its reception, in its legacy. The strangest fact is perhaps the simplest, that a film about men trapped in futility managed to escape its own, becoming timeless. Critical perspectives open the door to seeing this story not merely as a war drama, but as a living text that speaks to absurdism, philosophy, and the political theater of our time. The events inside that narrow trench resonate far beyond the mud and the mine. They carry echoes of Beckett and Sartre, of Kafka and Camus, of Brecht and Ionesco. To break it down critically is to realize that the film is not simply about a single war, nor even about war in general, but about the paralysis of humanity when caught in systems too large, too indifferent, too absurd to resolve. One of the most striking critical lenses is the absurdist one. The very premise, a wounded man immobilized by a mine, flanked by enemies turned reluctant companions, reads like a scene lifted from existential theater. Critics often compare it to Waiting for Godot, where characters are condemned to repeat gestures of hope and despair while nothing changes. The soldiers in the trench argue, insult, occasionally laugh, but ultimately remain frozen, their fates unchanged. The landmine is Godot itself, promised, threatening, the source of endless speculation, but never arriving as resolution. Under this lens, the film becomes not a war drama but an absurdist play in mud and blood, one that uses comedy to reveal despair. From a political perspective, the events serve as searing indictment of international institutions. The United Nations peacekeepers, with their vehicles and cameras and endless procedures, symbolize the paralysis of global politics. They arrive with authority yet act with impotence, trapped in their own rules. Their presence in the film mirrors real-world frustrations with peacekeeping missions that too often became bureaucratic exercises rather than solutions. Critics from the Balkans saw in this portrayal a direct satire of the world's inaction during the conflicts of the 1990s. Through this lens, the trench is not only battlefield but metaphorical meeting room, where human lives are sacrificed to the stalemate of diplomacy. The journalists circling the trench add another layer of critique. Their cameras capture suffering, their commentary shapes perception, but they never intervene. Under a media studies lens, They embody the voyeurism of war reporting, the transformation of human agony into consumable narrative. Events inside the trench are not simply lived, they are broadcast, commodified, stripped of intimacy and restructured for public consumption. This critique becomes sharper when we realize that the journalists are also us, the audience. We too sit at a distance, consuming the suffering as story. The film thus becomes metatextual, indicting its own viewers even as it entertains them. Events inside the trench also invite psychoanalytic reading. The two soldiers are mirror images, projections of each other's fears and hatreds. Their arguments, filled with venom and prejudice, are less about each other as men and more about the ideological shadows they carry. Each sees in the other what he most despises, but also what he most fears within himself. The wounded man, trapped and immobile, becomes the repressed trauma at the center of their psyches. Ignored, denied, but always threatening eruption. From this perspective, the trench is less battlefield than subconscious, a space where repression and projection battle endlessly without resolution. Historical criticism reads the film as allegory for the Balkan Wars themselves. The two soldiers represent divided nations, the wounded man symbolizes the civilians crushed beneath, the peacekeepers embody the international community, and the journalists reflect Western spectatorship. The stalemate in the trench mirrors the stalemate of the conflict, where peace was endlessly negotiated but rarely enforced, where civilians bore the brunt of violence while politicians traded rhetoric. Critics in this vein argue that the film distills years of war into one metaphorical scenario, a trench that could be Bosnia or Kosovo, or any space where hatred breeds stalemate. The events also invite ethical critique. One fun fact often retold is the laughter that dominated the set despite the grim subject matter. Between takes, actors cracked jokes, crew members pulled pranks, laughter rang out across the mud. It was survival mechanism, much like the dark humor of the characters. The absurdity of standing in a man-made trench, covered in mud, reciting lines about futility, demanded release. Cast and crew laughed until tears ran, only to snap back into tragic intensity when cameras rolled. The atmosphere was one of whiplash, grief and humor colliding as insistently off-camera as on. When the film was released, its reception stunned the team. They had expected niche interest, perhaps recognition at smaller festivals. Instead, it exploded onto the international stage, praised for its absurdist bite and political commentary. The Academy Award win was surreal, particularly for a production so small. Cast members recalled sitting in the ceremony's glow, bewildered at how their muddy trench had carried them into the most glamorous room in cinema. The irony was not lost. They had made a film about futility and stalemate, only to find themselves victorious in Hollywood. Perhaps the most enduring insight from production is how closely art and life intertwined. The mud, the language barriers, the improvisations, the laughter amid discomfort, all these elements echoed the very contradictions the film dramatized. The set was its own no man's land, an international space, full of miscommunication, absurdity, suffering, and resilience. The actors were not just portraying futility, they were living it in miniature, transforming reality into allegory with every take. And so the production itself became part of the story, an extension of the film's themes. It was made in mud, constrained by limits, defined by contradiction. It laughed at itself, mourned its accidents, embraced its absurdities. What the audience sees on screen is not polished fantasy but lived truth. Actors cold and damp, crew improvising solutions, all bound together by the determination to make something honest. The strangest fun fact, then, is that the film's absurdism was never entirely scripted. It seeped in through the process itself, making the act of creation as absurd, tragic, and human as the tale being told. The setting of this film is deceptively small, yet it contains universes. A trench carved into mud, a strip of earth between front lines, fields that stretch into haze. These spaces are not merely background but living metaphors. They become stage, prison, and mirror all at once. To step into them is to step into the essence of war itself, stripped of grandeur and spectacle, reduced to absurdity and claustrophobia. And in their careful construction, the film articulates its philosophy. That setting is not neutral but symbolic, that the ground itself can speak as loudly as any dialogue. The trench dominates the visual and emotional landscape. Its walls are damp, its floor slick, its shape narrow and confining. At first glance, it seems like nothing more than a tactical remnant, a leftover scar from countless battles. But as the story unfolds, the trench reveals itself as central character. It traps the soldiers in proximity, forcing enmity into intimacy. It denies them escape, its mud walls both protecting and imprisoning. In literary terms, it becomes allegorical space, a liminal zone where categories collapse, where enemy and ally lose distinction, where survival itself is absurd. The trench is both safety and death sentence, both shield and coffin. Its paradoxical nature mirrors the paradox of war. It preserves only to destroy, shelters only to suffocate. The landmine lying beneath the wounded man elevates this setting into theater of absurd. It is not weapon in action but weapon in waiting, silent yet absolute in its threat. The camera lingers on it sparingly, refusing to sensationalize, yet its presence dominates every frame. The mine is invisible gravity, pulling all actions, words, and gestures toward futility. In cinematic terms, it functions as axis, the still point around which chaos spins. In symbolic terms, it is war itself, buried, silent, omnipresent, capable of annihilation without reason. The trench without the mine is ordinary mud. With the mine, it becomes stage for philosophy. The fields surrounding the trench stretch outward into mist. They are shot in wide frames that contrast with the claustrophobic interiors of the trench. Where the trench suffocates, the fields seem infinite, yet they too carry emptiness. They are not fertile or alive, but barren, scarred, littered with remnants of conflict. Soldiers who stumble through them are reduced to silhouettes against fog, anonymous figures swallowed by emptiness. These fields embody the larger war. Vast, incomprehensible, indifferent. In juxtaposing the intimate trench with the expansive battlefield, the film conveys both micro and macro, the futility of the small mirrored by the futility of the large. Lighting plays crucial role in shaping these spaces. In the trench, light is muted, filtered through haze, often casting shadows across mud-streaked faces. This creates claustrophobia, as though even the sun hesitates to pierce the absurdity below. In open fields, however, the light becomes harsh, unfiltered, washing the landscape in pale desolation. There is no warmth in this brightness, only exposure. The alternation between dim and harsh lighting mirrors the soldier's psychological state, trapped between concealment and exposure, between the shadow of death and the glare of futility. Sound design transforms setting into atmosphere. In the trench, every movement is amplified. The squelch of boots in mud, the rasp of breath, the groan of the wounded man. Silence is weaponized, stretching moments into unbearable tension. Then, in contrast, the distant thunder of artillery rumbles across the fields, a reminder that larger battles rage beyond, indifferent to the microcosm below. The soundscape creates duality, intimacy of mud and breath versus enormity of explosions beyond. We are forced to feel both simultaneously, the personal and the impersonal, the near and the distant. The arrival of UN peacekeepers shifts the cinematic elements again. Their vehicles, crisp uniforms, and gleaming equipment contrast violently with the mud-stained trench. Cinematography emphasizes this dissonance. Clean lines of trucks against jagged trench walls, sterile radio chatter against groans of the wounded. The peacekeepers' polished image becomes visual symbol of bureaucracy's disconnect from lived suffering. The setting underscores their impotence, their clean vehicles parked uselessly near mud they will not enter. Journalists bring another layer. Their cameras intrude into the trench, lenses gleaming like predatory eyes. Cinematography frames them as voyeurs, crouched at edges, recording suffering without sharing it. The juxtaposition of their sleek equipment against the mud-stained soldiers turns setting into indictment. War as spectacle, trench as theater, men as unwilling performers. The camera within the camera doubles the absurdity, reflecting cinema back onto itself. Cinematically, Critics admire how events are staged as theater of minimalism. The trench is set, the actors few, the props simple. This reduction forces focus onto dialogue, gesture, and silence. Critics compare it to chamber plays, where confined spaces reveal grand themes. The landmine becomes the most minimal of props, barely visible, static, yet it drives the entire narrative. This minimalist staging becomes symbolic of war itself, immense suffering distilled into the smallest, most claustrophobic of spaces. From a postmodern lens, the film revels in contradiction. It is at once comic and tragic, absurd and realistic, intimate and political. It refuses singular interpretation, instead layering multiple discourses. Events in the trench can be read as literal, symbolic, allegorical, or all at once. The refusal to resolve, the mine never detonating, the stalemate never breaking, mirrors postmodern suspicion of grand narratives. There is no heroic arc, no redemptive ending, no closure. There is only suspension, contradiction, ambiguity. The events mock our hunger for resolution, insisting instead on reflecting reality's refusal to provide it. Even the humor itself is event. Critics debate whether the dark comedy undermines or enhances the tragedy. For many, the humor sharpens the pain, making the absurdity unbearable precisely because it makes us laugh before it devastates us. The soldiers' banter becomes a shield, a survival mechanism, but also a critique of our own laughter. When we chuckle at their insults, at their squabbles, we become complicit in the absurdity, laughing at suffering we should mourn. The humor is not relief but trap, and that is the event's most brilliant cruelty. In the end, critical perspectives converge on one truth. The events in the trench are allegory. They are too precise, too absurd, too distilled to be otherwise. The mine is the war, the trench is the Balkans, the soldiers are nations, the peacekeepers are the UN, the journalists are us. Every event resonates outward, beyond the mud and the mine, into philosophy, politics, ethics, media, and history. What begins as a story of three men becomes a mirror in which entire systems are reflected, condemned, and revealed as absurd. And perhaps the most devastating perspective is the simplest: realism. Critics remind us that while the trench is allegory, its absurdity is not exaggerated. Wars do trap men in futility, institutions do fail, journalists do exploit. The events may play like theater of the absurd, but they are also brutally real. And that truth, that the absurd is not invention but reflection, is what makes this story unforgettable. Production stories for this film have their own strange pulse. Muddy, chaotic, improvised, and laced with irony, just like the trench at the center of the narrative. To trace how it was made is to see how process mirrored product, how the absurdist spirit of the film existed not just in its text but in its creation. What unfolded behind the camera was itself a no man's land, a space between vision and accident, between tight control and wild unpredictability, between tragedy and laughter. The first and most striking detail is the trench itself. Rather than building a polished set on a soundstage, the production team literally carved a trench into the earth. Shovels, sweat, and rain did the work, producing a muddy channel that soaked the cast from boots to collar. The ground was perpetually damp, seeping into uniforms, staining everything with a grime that was never faked. Actors spoke later of how the trench itself became their co-star, unyielding, claustrophobic, and suffocating. By the end of long shooting days, they would peel their uniforms off like second skins, their bodies stiff from crouching in mud. That physical discomfort was not performance, it was reality, captured raw on film. The infamous landmine prop carried its own mythology. Though it was an inert device, painted and assembled for safety, cast and crew treated it with near reverence. Something about its presence in the trench made everyone cautious, as if the fiction of its danger seeped into their bones. Actors would tiptoe around it, crew members joked nervously whenever someone leaned too close, and tension would build during takes until laughter erupted between scenes. It became a psychological weight, embodying the very absurdity the story sought to dramatize, a harmless object that carried imaginary yet palpable threat. Filming in multiple languages brought its own layer of chaos. The production was an international collaboration, drawing cast and crew from across Europe. On set, conversations bounced between Bosnian, French, English, and other tongues, creating moments of both confusion and humor. Directions had to be translated twice, jokes lost their punch before regaining it, and misunderstandings occasionally caused retakes. Yet this Babel-like atmosphere ended up serving the film. Just as the characters in the story miscommunicate, mistrust, and half-understand one another, so too did the crew in reality. The trench became a polyglot stage where language barriers echoed the divisions the narrative critiqued. Budget constraints meant that every resource had to be stretched to its limit. Costumes were worn until they frayed, props repurposed again and again, camera equipment kept alive with constant repairs. There was no luxury of endless takes. If the light was fading and a scene wasn't working, the choice was often to keep rolling anyway, to embrace imperfection as authenticity. This low-budget urgency infused the film with raw energy. Its grain, its shadows, its occasional roughness are not flaws but evidence of resourcefulness. Critics would later praise its stripped-down realism, not realizing that necessity, not design, had driven many of those choices. The cast brought their own memories of conflict into their performances. Several of them had lived through the Balkan Wars, carrying personal scars that informed their roles. Their familiarity with the absurdity of checkpoints, the uncertainty of front lines, the gallows humor of survival, all of it bled into their acting. Lines delivered with bitterness were sharpened by lived experience. Moments of laughter carried the edge of recognition. In this sense, the film was not just performance but testimony, the actors channeling memories they could not fully leave behind. The presence of journalists on set added another strange twist. Real reporters visited to document the making of the film, mingling with actors playing journalists. At times, crew members couldn't tell the difference. Cameras captured cameras capturing cameras, blurring fiction and reality. The production itself became meta-commentary, the act of filming war becoming indistinguishable from the act of documenting it. The irony was uncanny. A film critiquing media spectacle found itself creating one. The weather refused to cooperate, another layer of absurdity. Rain fell on days that demanded dryness, sun blazed during sequences meant to feel bleak. Instead of fighting it, the director leaned in. Muddy slips and unexpected showers were woven into the film, accidents folded into narrative. One actor's genuine stumble became part of the final cut, the authenticity of exhaustion too valuable to discard. This embrace of unpredictability mirrored the story's central thesis. Control is illusion, absurdity inevitable. Actors would tiptoe around it, crew members joked nervously whenever someone leaned too close, and tension would build during takes until laughter erupted between scenes. It became a psychological weight, embodying the very absurdity the story sought to dramatize, a harmless object that carried imaginary yet palpable threat. Filming in multiple languages brought its own layer of chaos. The production was an international collaboration, drawing cast and crew from across Europe. On set, conversations bounced between Bosnian, French, English, and other tongues, creating moments of both confusion and humor. Directions had to be translated twice, jokes lost their punch before regaining it, and misunderstandings occasionally caused retakes. Yet this Babel-like atmosphere ended up serving the film. Just as the characters in the story miscommunicate, mistrust, and half-understand one another, so too did the crew in reality. The trench became a polyglot stage where language barriers echoed the divisions the narrative critiqued. Budget constraints meant that every resource had to be stretched to its limit. Costumes were worn until they frayed, props repurposed again and again, camera equipment kept alive with constant repairs. There was no luxury of endless takes. If the light was fading and a scene wasn't working, the choice was often to keep rolling anyway, to embrace imperfection as authenticity. This low-budget urgency infused the film with raw energy. Its grain, its shadows, its occasional roughness are not flaws but evidence of resourcefulness. Critics would later praise its stripped-down realism, not realizing that necessity, not design, had driven many of those choices. The cast brought their own memories of conflict into their performances. Several of them had lived through the Balkan Wars, carrying personal scars that informed their roles. Their familiarity with the absurdity of checkpoints, the uncertainty of front lines, the gallows humor of survival, all of it bled into their acting. Lines delivered with bitterness were sharpened by lived experience. Moments of laughter carried the edge of recognition. In this sense, the film was not just performance but testimony, the actors channeling memories they could not fully leave behind. The presence of journalists on set added another strange twist. Real reporters visited to document the making of the film, mingling with actors playing journalists. At times, crew members couldn't tell the difference. Cameras captured cameras capturing cameras, blurring fiction and reality. The production itself became meta-commentary, the act of filming war becoming indistinguishable from the act of documenting it. The irony was uncanny. A film critiquing media spectacle found itself creating one. The weather refused to cooperate, another layer of absurdity. Rain fell on days that demanded dryness, sun blazed during sequences meant to feel bleak. Instead of fighting it, the director leaned in. Muddy slips and unexpected showers were woven into the film, accidents folded into narrative. One actor's genuine stumble became part of the final cut, the authenticity of exhaustion too valuable to discard. This embrace of unpredictability mirrored the story's central thesis. Control is illusion, absurdity inevitable. One fun fact often retold is the laughter that dominated the set despite the grim subject matter. Between takes, actors cracked jokes, crew members pulled pranks, laughter rang out across the mud. It was survival mechanism, much like the dark humor of the characters. The absurdity of standing in a man-made trench, covered in mud, reciting lines about futility, demanded release. Cast and crew laughed until tears ran, only to snap back into tragic intensity when cameras rolled. The atmosphere was one of whiplash, grief and humor colliding as insistently off-camera as on. When the film was released, its reception stunned the team. They had expected niche interest, perhaps recognition at smaller festivals. Instead, it exploded onto the international stage, praised for its absurdist bite and political commentary. The Academy Award win was surreal, particularly for a production so small. Cast members recalled sitting in the ceremony's glow, bewildered at how their muddy trench had carried them into the most glamorous room in cinema. The irony was not lost. They had made a film about futility and stalemate, only to find themselves victorious in Hollywood. Perhaps the most enduring insight from production is how closely art and life intertwined. The mud, the language barriers, the improvisations, the laughter amid discomfort, all these elements echoed the very contradictions the film dramatized. The set was its own no man's land, an international space, full of miscommunication, absurdity, suffering, and resilience. The actors were not just portraying futility, they were living it in miniature, transforming reality into allegory with every take. And so the production itself became part of the story, an extension of the film's themes. It was made in mud, constrained by limits, defined by contradiction. It laughed at itself, mourned its accidents, embraced its absurdities. What the audience sees on screen is not polished fantasy but lived truth. Actors cold and damp, crew improvising solutions, all bound together by the determination to make something honest. The strangest fun fact, then, is that the film's absurdism was never entirely scripted. It seeped in through the process itself, making the act of creation as absurd, tragic, and human as the tale being told. The setting of this film is deceptively small, yet it contains universes. A trench carved into mud, a strip of earth between front lines, fields that stretch into haze. These spaces are not merely background but living metaphors. They become stage, prison, and mirror all at once. To step into them is to step into the essence of war itself, stripped of grandeur and spectacle, reduced to absurdity and claustrophobia. And in their careful construction, the film articulates its philosophy. That setting is not neutral but symbolic, that the ground itself can speak as loudly as any dialogue. The trench dominates the visual and emotional landscape. Its walls are damp, its floor slick, its shape narrow and confining. At first glance, it seems like nothing more than a tactical remnant, a leftover scar from countless battles. But as the story unfolds, the trench reveals itself as central character. It traps the soldiers in proximity, forcing enmity into intimacy. It denies them escape, its mud walls both protecting and imprisoning. In literary terms, it becomes allegorical space, a liminal zone where categories collapse, where enemy and ally lose distinction, where survival itself is absurd. The trench is both safety and death sentence, both shield and coffin. Its paradoxical nature mirrors the paradox of war. It preserves only to destroy, shelters only to suffocate. The landmine lying beneath the wounded man elevates this setting into theater of absurd. It is not weapon in action but weapon in waiting, silent yet absolute in its threat. The camera lingers on it sparingly, refusing to sensationalize, yet its presence dominates every frame. The mine is invisible gravity, pulling all actions, words, and gestures toward futility. In cinematic terms, it functions as axis, the still point around which chaos spins. In symbolic terms, it is war itself, buried, silent, omnipresent, capable of annihilation without reason. The trench without the mine is ordinary mud. With the mine, it becomes stage for philosophy. The fields surrounding the trench stretch outward into mist. They are shot in wide frames that contrast with the claustrophobic interiors of the trench. Where the trench suffocates, the fields seem infinite, yet they too carry emptiness. They are not fertile or alive, but barren, scarred, littered with remnants of conflict. Soldiers who stumble through them are reduced to silhouettes against fog, anonymous figures swallowed by emptiness. These fields embody the larger war. Vast, incomprehensible, indifferent. In juxtaposing the intimate trench with the expansive battlefield, the film conveys both micro and macro, the futility of the small mirrored by the futility of the large. Lighting plays crucial role in shaping these spaces. In the trench, light is muted, filtered through haze, often casting shadows across mud-streaked faces. This creates claustrophobia, as though even the sun hesitates to pierce the absurdity below. In open fields, however, the light becomes harsh, unfiltered, washing the landscape in pale desolation. There is no warmth in this brightness, only exposure. The alternation between dim and harsh lighting mirrors the soldier's psychological state, trapped between concealment and exposure, between the shadow of death and the glare of futility. Sound design transforms setting into atmosphere. In the trench, every movement is amplified. The squelch of boots in mud, the rasp of breath, the groan of the wounded man. Silence is weaponized, stretching moments into unbearable tension. Then, in contrast, the distant thunder of artillery rumbles across the fields, a reminder that larger battles rage beyond, indifferent to the microcosm below. The soundscape creates duality, intimacy of mud and breath versus enormity of explosions beyond. We are forced to feel both simultaneously, the personal and the impersonal, the near and the distant. The arrival of UN peacekeepers shifts the cinematic elements again. Their vehicles, crisp uniforms, and gleaming equipment contrast violently with the mud-stained trench. Cinematography emphasizes this dissonance. Clean lines of trucks against jagged trench walls, sterile radio chatter against groans of the wounded. The peacekeepers' polished image becomes visual symbol of bureaucracy's disconnect from lived suffering. The setting underscores their impotence, their clean vehicles parked uselessly near mud they will not enter. Journalists bring another layer. Their cameras intrude into the trench, lenses gleaming like predatory eyes. Cinematography frames them as voyeurs, crouched at edges, recording suffering without sharing it. The juxtaposition of their sleek equipment against the mud-stained soldiers turns setting into indictment. War as spectacle, trench as theater, men as unwilling performers. The camera within the camera doubles the absurdity, reflecting cinema back onto itself. Editing choices heighten the symbolic function of setting. Long takes within the trench stretch time, forcing us to endure claustrophobia. Abrupt cuts to open fields fracture this rhythm, creating dissonance between confinement and emptiness. The pacing mirrors the futility. endless waiting punctuated by sudden chaos, stagnation interrupted by explosions. The editing does not provide comfort, it insists on discomfort, embedding us within the absurd rhythm of war. Color palette is deliberate. Muted greens, browns, grays. There are no vibrant hues, no aesthetic flourishes. The palette drains life from the screen, echoing the drained humanity of the soldiers. Occasional splashes of red, blood, insignia, puncture this monotony, sharp reminders of violence embedded in mud. The absence of color becomes its own language, insisting that war is not spectacle of glory but erosion of life into monotone. Symbolically, setting carries layered meanings. The trench is conflict itself, narrow and confining, forcing enemies into intimacy. The mine is inevitability, destruction always latent. The fields are history, vast and indifferent, swallowing lives without notice. The UN vehicles are bureaucracy, polished yet useless. The journalists' cameras are spectatorship, transforming tragedy into consumable image. Together, these settings create a mosaic of absurdity, where every space embodies a facet of war's futility. From a theoretical perspective, the film employs mise-en-scene to collapse the boundary between literal and metaphorical. Every element of setting is double-coded. Trench as trench and as allegory, mine as prop and as philosophy, fields as landscape and as history. Cinematic elements, lighting, sound, color, editing, reinforce this duality. Nothing is neutral. Everything signifies. In this sense, the film is not realism but hyperrealism, where the ordinary becomes allegorical under the weight of war. By the time we leave the story, what lingers are not only faces and fates, but spaces. The mud clings, the mine waits, the trench suffocates, the fields stretch endlessly. These settings outlast characters, reminding us that individuals come and go, but the absurdity of war remains etched into the ground. The cinematic elements ensure that we cannot forget. The claustrophobia of shadows, the glare of futility, the silence broken by groans and distant thunder. The world of the film is the world of war itself. Confined, absurd, indifferent, and unforgettable. Behind the scenes of this film lies a story as layered, contradictory, and unsettling as the trench it immortalized. To understand how it was made is to see how life and art bled into each other. How mud, politics, humor, and grief combined to create a work that feels less like fiction than testimony. The making of it was itself a no man's land, a space where cultures collided, languages overlapped, and accidents reshaped intentions. The trench, that claustrophobic stage where most of the drama unfolds, was not constructed with Hollywood artifice. It was dug, by hand, into damp earth. The mud that cakes the actors was real. The chill that seeped into their uniforms was the same chill that clung to the crew. Every day began with the same ritual. Boots sinking into wet soil, equipment balanced precariously against the sucking weight of mud. Actors spoke of the trench as an adversary. It exhausted them, confined them, left their bodies aching. Yet that very discomfort lent the performances their authenticity. What the audience sees as fatigue is fatigue. What they see as claustrophobia is claustrophobia. The trench was not just set, it was collaborator, shaping every gesture, every sigh, every grimace. The landmine prop, inert and harmless, became something more than wood and paint. Its presence created real tension on set. Crew members, rationally aware of its harmlessness, still found themselves stepping carefully around it. Actors admitted to holding their breath when positioned near it, as though their bodies refused to accept its fiction. The prop's psychological weight mirrored the absurdity of the story itself, an object of imagined danger producing genuine fear. Even in rehearsal, its silent threat haunted the atmosphere. Filming in multiple languages created its own layer of absurdity. The international nature of the production meant dialogue in Bosnian, French, English, and beyond. Communication required constant translation, and misunderstandings became routine. Directions were misheard, jokes lost their bite when filtered through interpreters, cues stumbled across linguistic barriers. Yet rather than breaking the production, this chaos mirrored the film's themes. Just as the soldiers in the trench mistrust and misinterpret one another, so too did the crew grapple with fractured communication. In this sense, the set itself became allegorical, a real-world echo of the story being told. Budget limitations forced improvisation. Equipment was stretched beyond intended use, costumes recycled and patched, props repurposed. Light fading too quickly meant shots had to be captured in haste, with imperfections embraced as texture rather than flaw. The crew joked that the trench ate money as greedily as it ate boots. Yet these limitations lent the film its raw realism. The grain of the image, the unevenness of lighting, the roughness of the sound. What might have been polished away in bigger productions became evidence of truth here. Critics praised the stripped-down aesthetic, unaware that necessity, not aesthetic choice alone, dictated much of it. The actors carried more than scripts into the trench. They carried memory. Several had lived through the Balkan Wars. Their performances were sharpened by personal experience, their delivery of lines infused with authenticity that could not be faked. When they raged, it was with memory. When they laughed bitterly, it was with recognition. For them, the film was not just art but confrontation, a chance to embody and exorcise trauma. Some later confessed that filming reopened wounds. Others said it allowed them to process grief. The authenticity of their performances lies not only in craft but in lived history. The presence of journalists added another layer of surrealism. Reporters visited the set, filming the making of the film even as actors portrayed journalists filming war within it. The result was a hall of mirrors. Cameras capturing cameras capturing cameras. Crew members sometimes lost track of who was performing and who was documenting. The irony was not lost on the director, who quipped that the film's critique of media spectacle was already being proven by its own making. Weather, unpredictable and merciless, became both obstacle and collaborator. Rain fell when sunshine was scheduled. Sunlight broke through during sequences meant to feel bleak. Instead of resisting, the director incorporated these shifts. Mudslides, puddles, sudden shafts of light. All were folded into the narrative. One actor's genuine stumble in slippery mud made it into the final cut, its raw authenticity too valuable to discard. Nature itself seemed determined to remind everyone of absurdity, echoing the film's insistence that control is illusion. The mood on set was a paradox. Between takes, laughter reigned. The absurdity of crouching in mud, arguing over lines about futility, produced gallows humor. Cast and crew played pranks, shared jokes, mocked their own discomfort. Yet when cameras rolled, the weight of the material pressed down, silencing laughter into solemnity. The whiplash between hilarity and grief mirrored the tone of the film itself. One day might end with aching ribs from laughter, another with tears shed in silence. The trench was both playground and tomb. When the film premiered, the response stunned those who had made it. They had expected modest recognition, perhaps appreciation at festivals. Instead, it exploded onto the international stage, embraced for its absurdist bite and moral clarity. The Academy Award win felt surreal. Mud-caked actors and low-budget crew suddenly thrust into Hollywood glamour. Cast members remembered staring at tuxedos and chandeliers, dazed that their trench of futility had brought them here. The irony was rich. They had crafted a story about stalemate, only to achieve global victory. What lingers most from behind the scenes is how closely the making of the film echoed its themes. The trench trapped actors as it trapped characters. The mind, though fake, carried real fear. Communication fractured across languages. Institutions failed to provide resources, forcing improvisation. Humor and grief coexisted, sometimes within the same minute. Reality and fiction blurred, leaving cast and crew unsure where one ended and the other began. The making of the film was itself a no-man's land, absurd and profound. And so, the behind-the-scenes story becomes more than trivia. It is extension of the film's philosophy. Just as the narrative insists that war is absurd theater, the production revealed that art itself is shaped by absurdity. Mud, memory, language, laughter, and loss combine to create not just a film but an experience lived as much as performed. To understand this film is to understand that its authenticity was not crafted in post-production but carved into mud, endured in rain, whispered through laughter and silence alike. Themes and symbolism form the subterranean architecture of this film, the invisible beams holding up its trench of mud and despair. To approach it as mere war drama is to miss its literary bones, for this is a parable built of irony and contradiction, absurdist theater disguised as battlefield realism. Each theme emerges not from sweeping statements but from mud-caked bodies, each symbol pressed into the soil with the same weight as the landmine that dominates the narrative. The most obvious and devastating theme is futility. The very premise embodies it. Two enemies trapped together, a wounded comrade balanced on a mine, a war raging beyond that neither can influence. No matter their choices, the result is stalemate. Every attempt at resolution collapses into absurd failure. Futility becomes not simply backdrop but philosophy, the recognition that in war there are no victors, only survivors and corpses. The landmine itself symbolizes this futility, an object that embodies paralysis. Its silence is louder than gunfire, its stillness heavier than movement. It reminds us that war's cruelty lies less in action than in waiting for inevitability. Absurdity runs alongside futility, twin themes that shape every scene. Critics often compare the trench to a stage in a play by Beckett or Ionesco. The soldiers argue endlessly, their conversations looping in circles, their gestures repeating without progress. Humor bubbles through, dark and biting, making us laugh even as we recognize the despair beneath. This absurdity is not comic relief but revelation. It shows us that war itself is theater of the absurd, its logic senseless, its outcomes grotesquely inevitable. The laughter curdles in the throat, forcing us to acknowledge the thin line between comedy and tragedy. Another central theme is mistrust. The two soldiers, though forced into proximity, cannot shed the weight of centuries of hatred. Every flicker of humanity they glimpse in each other is quickly smothered by suspicion. Their dialogue becomes a microcosm of the larger conflict. Even when survival demands cooperation, history whispers betrayal. This theme is symbolized by the trench walls themselves. Narrow, suffocating, they force closeness yet prevent escape. The walls mirror mistrust, trapping men together while reminding them that separation still exists, that division is baked into the ground. The wounded man becomes the film's most potent symbol, embodying helplessness and the civilian body crushed beneath the weight of war. Immobilized by the mine, his survival depends not on his own will but on others' choices. He cannot move, cannot fight, cannot save himself. He is war's collateral, alive yet doomed, present yet already written off. His body becomes allegory for every innocent caught in conflicts they did not choose, every life turned into bargaining chip by forces beyond their control. In him, war's dehumanization is laid bare. International impotence emerges as theme through the peacekeepers. They arrive with authority, their uniforms crisp, their vehicles polished, yet they are powerless to act. They symbolize the paralysis of institutions, bureaucracy triumphing over compassion, rules smothering morality. Their presence is ironic. Those tasked with preserving peace do nothing while men suffer. They embody the hypocrisy of global politics, their inaction becoming as destructive as bullets. Symbolically, their clean vehicles parked beside muddy trenches reflect the chasm between rhetoric and reality. The journalists add the theme of voyeurism. Their cameras intrude, their commentary transforms suffering into spectacle. They symbolize the way war becomes narrative for outsiders, consumed as story rather than endured as reality. Their presence forces the soldiers to become performers, their agony mediated by lenses. Symbolically, the journalists represent us, the audience, safe, detached, consuming images of war without touching its mud. The camera within the camera indicts spectatorship itself, asking whether watching is complicity. The film also grapples with the theme of identity. Stripped of armies, of context, the soldiers are reduced to men. They cling to insults and ideology to preserve the illusion of difference, yet their shared suffering reveals sameness. Their identities are both individual and symbolic. they are men and nations, human beings and abstractions. This instability of identity reflects the instability of war itself, where individuals are consumed by collective narratives yet still bleed individually. Silence functions as symbol throughout. Long stretches of inaction, punctuated by groans or distant artillery, carry more weight than dialogue. Silence here is not emptiness but presence, the presence of inevitability, of death waiting, of words unspoken. In literature, silence often marks the limits of language. In this film, silence marks the limits of war's logic. It is the moment when ideology evaporates, leaving only breath and mud. The trench itself is perhaps the most encompassing symbol. It is war reduced to geography, a space that protects and imprisons simultaneously. Its mud walls confine, its narrowness denies escape, its dampness seeps into bones. The trench is history carved into earth, forcing men to enact absurdity within its confines. It symbolizes not only the battlefield but the human condition when trapped in cycles of violence. Narrow, suffocating, without exit. Another layer of symbolism lies in the mind's refusal to detonate. In most war stories, the ticking bomb explodes, catharsis arrives through destruction. Here, catharsis never comes. The mind persists, silent, unresolved, even at the end. This refusal symbolizes the endlessness of conflict, the wounds that never heal, the future suspended in uncertainty. The mine is not climax but stalemate, a symbol of wars that linger long after ceasefires are declared. Themes of performance also run through. The soldiers become actors for journalists, peacekeepers become actors for cameras, the film itself becomes performance of war's absurdity. This layering blurs fiction and reality, turning every event into staged spectacle. Symbolically, it critiques the way war is always mediated, always transformed into image and narrative, never experienced directly by those who consume it from afar. Finally, the absence of resolution becomes itself both theme and symbol. The story ends in ambiguity, the mine unresolved, the trench unemptied. This refusal of closure mirrors war's reality. Conflicts end not with neat conclusions but with unanswered questions, unresolved pain, unfinished lives. The ambiguity symbolizes truth itself, that war leaves more hanging than resolved, more silence than story. Taken together, these themes and symbols form a tapestry of contradiction. Futility and absurdity, mistrust and humanity, voyeurism and impotence, identity and erasure, all coexist